As a scholar who has dedicated a lifetime to the intricate philosophical systems and rich narrative traditions of Buddhism, I find the question of the real Buddha to be one of the most challenging and compelling intellectual journeys one can undertake. We stand today at a great distance from the dusty plains of the 5th century BCE Gangetic Basin, separated by millennia and by layers of devotion, doctrine, and mythology that have grown around the figure of Siddhartha Gautama like a great banyan tree around its original trunk. To seek the historical Buddha is not an act of cynicism or disbelief, rather, it is a work of profound respect. It is an attempt to understand the man whose life and insights were so monumentally significant that they inspired one of the world's great spiritual traditions. This quest is a delicate exercise in historical and textual archaeology. It requires us to move beyond the deified figure of the celestial Buddha, adorned with supernatural marks and capable of cosmic miracles, and to search for the human teacher who walked the earth, felt the dust on his feet, and spoke to his fellow men and women about the nature of suffering and its end. It is a process of sifting through sources that are themselves acts of faith, of correlating ancient texts with the sparse but powerful testimony of stone and brick, and of placing this extraordinary individual firmly within the vibrant, turbulent, and spiritually charged world in which he lived. The goal is not to diminish the Buddha by stripping him of his legendary grandeur. Instead, the aim is to uncover a figure who is, in many ways, even more remarkable. A historical person whose authentic human journey of struggle, discovery, and compassion became the very foundation for the myths that would later seek to explain him. In this exploration, we will peel back the layers of hagiography and doctrine to uncover the plausible historical core of the Buddha's life. Not to discard the legend, but to understand precisely why it was necessary. Uncovering the real history of the Buddha. Part 1. The scholarly quest and the problem of sources. The single greatest challenge in reconstructing the life of the historical Buddha is the nature of our sources. Unlike figures like Julius Caesar or Confucius, the Buddha left behind no writings of his own. The vast collection of teachings attributed to him, the Pali Canon, was a product of a vibrant and disciplined oral tradition, meticulously memorized and chanted by generations of monks for centuries before being committed to writing. The first complete written version of the Pali Canon was not produced until the 1st century BCE in Sri Lanka, some 400 years after the Buddha's death. This significant time lag means that the texts we possess are not a verbatim transcript of his words, but a record shaped by memory, interpretation, and the institutional needs of the early monastic community. The nature of the Pali Canon. The Pali Canon, or Tipitaka, 3 baskets, is our primary textual witness. It consists of the Sutta Pitaka, the basket of discourses, containing tens of thousands of sermons and dialogues attributed to the Buddha and his senior disciples. The Vinaya Pitaka, the basket of monastic discipline, outlining the rules and procedures for the Sangha, the monastic community. The Abhidhamma Pitaka, the basket of higher, or special, doctrine, a later and highly scholastic systematization of the teachings found in the suttas. For the historian, the Abhidhamma is largely disregarded as a direct source for the Buddha's life, being a clear product of a later, more analytical phase of Buddhist thought. The Sutta and Vinaya Pitakas, however, are invaluable. They contain a wealth of biographical fragments, place names, and references to contemporary rulers and rival teachers, all embedded within the primary context of doctrinal teachings and monastic regulations. The challenge lies in the fact that these texts are not biographies in the modern sense. They're gospel texts, designed to inspire faith and guide practice, not to provide an objective historical record. Textual stratigraphy, and the search for the earliest layers. Modern scholarship has approached this challenge through a method akin to textual archaeology or stratigraphy. The goal is to identify the earliest layers of the tradition, which are most likely to contain the authentic voice of the founder, and to distinguish them from later additions and elaborations. Through comparative studies of different canonical languages, Pali, Sanskrit, Chinese, Tibetan, and analysis of literary style and doctrinal development, a general consensus has emerged. The oldest material is believed to reside within the first 4 Nikayas, collections, of the Sutta Pitaka, the Digha, Majjhima, Samyutta, and Anguttara Nikayas, and in the oldest parts of the Vinaya. Particularly the Patimokkha, the core monastic code, and certain narrative sections. These early texts tend to portray the Buddha in a more human and relatable manner. He gets tired, suffers from back pain, deals with quarrelsome monks, and engages in robust, sometimes sharp, debate with his philosophical opponents. The supernatural elements are present, but often less grandiose than in later works. Conversely, texts like the Jataka tales, stories of the Buddha's past lives, the Buddhavamsa, a chronicle of past Buddhas, and the Apadana, stories of the past lives of saints, found in the later Khuddaka Nikaya, are almost universally considered to be later additions. These works present a more developed Buddhology, elevating the Buddha to a cosmic, almost divine status, the culmination of eons of spiritual striving across countless lifetimes. While invaluable for understanding the development of Buddhist devotion, they are not reliable sources for the historical figure of Siddhartha Gautama. The crucial corroboration of archaeology. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, some Western scholars even questioned whether the Buddha was a historical figure at all, suggesting he might be a solar myth or a symbolic personification. This skepticism was largely put to rest by the powerful, tangible evidence of archaeology. The most significant archaeological discoveries are the pillars erected by the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka in the 3rd century BCE. Ashoka, a convert to Buddhism, ruled a vast Indian empire roughly 2 centuries after the Buddha's death. He inscribed pillars and rocks across his domain with edicts promoting the Dharma. These pillars provide the first external, non-scriptural evidence for the Buddhist tradition. The most important of these is the pillar found at Lumbini, in modern-day Nepal. Its inscription reads, Hida Buddhi Jait Sakamuniati, here the Buddha, the sage of the Shakyas, was born. Ashoka personally visited this site, which he identified as the Buddha's birthplace, and exempted the local village from taxes. This is the closest thing historians have to a birth certificate. It provides powerful evidence that, by the 3rd century BCE, the Buddha was firmly regarded as a historical personage from the Shakya clan, and his birthplace was a known location of pilgrimage. Further archaeological work has identified and excavated other key sites mentioned in the texts, such as Sarnath, where he gave his first sermon, Bodh Gaya, the site of his enlightenment, Savatthi, where he spent many rainy seasons, and Kushinagar, the site of his death. The consistency between the geographical landscape described in the Pali Canon and the archaeological findings on the ground lends significant credibility to the textual tradition. Archaeology provides the physical stage upon which the historical drama of the Buddha's life can be plausibly reconstructed. Part 2. The World of the Buddha, the Gangetic Plain in the 5th century BCE. To understand the Buddha, one must understand his world. He was not a lone prophet in a cultural desert, but an active participant in one of the most dynamic and transformative periods in Indian history. The Gangetic Plain of the 5th century BCE was a crucible of social, political, and spiritual change. The social and political landscape. The old, semi-nomadic Vedic societies were giving way to a more settled, agrarian civilization. This led to the rise of cities, the development of trade routes, and a new urban class of merchants and artisans. Politically, the landscape was dominated by a collection of kingdoms and republics known as the Mahajanapadas, or great realms. The most powerful of these were the expansionist monarchies of Kosala and Magadha, ruled by kings like Pasenadi and Bimbisara, both of whom feature in the Buddhist scriptures as patrons or interlocutors of the Buddha. The Buddha himself was born not in one of these great monarchies, but in a smaller, oligarchic republic, the land of the Shakyas, situated on the periphery of this world, with its capital at Kapilavatthu. His father, Suddhodana, was likely an elected chieftain or part of a council of ruling nobles, not the grand, absolute king portrayed in later legends. The Shakyas were a proud warrior clan, Khattiya, but their independence was precarious. The texts record, likely accurately, their eventual subjugation by the growing kingdom of Kosala. This context of political upheaval and the fragility of worldly power would have provided a powerful, real-world lesson on the truth of impermanence, anicca, and likely informed the bodhisattva's decision to renounce a life of secular leadership. The spiritual ferment, Brahmanism and the Sramana movement. The spiritual landscape was even more dynamic. The dominant religious ideology was Brahmanism, a tradition based on the sacred authority of the Vedas. The Brahmins were the hereditary priestly class who maintained social order and cosmic harmony through the performance of complex rituals and sacrifices to the gods. This system was hierarchical, with the Brahmins at the top, and it sanctified the rigid social structure of the caste system, Varna. However, the 6th and 5th centuries BCE saw the rise of a powerful counter-cultural movement known as the Sramanas, in Pali. Samana, these were wandering ascetics, seekers, and philosophers who rejected the authority of the Vedas, the efficacy of Brahmanical ritual, and the legitimacy of the caste system. They were religious individualists and experimenters who left the life of the householder to pursue personal spiritual liberation. The Sramana movement was incredibly diverse, encompassing a wide range of philosophies. The Jains, led by the Buddha's contemporary Mahavira, who taught a path of radical asceticism and non-violence, ahimsa, based on the idea of liberating the eternal soul, jiva, from karmic matter. The Ajivikas, led by Macaulay Gosala, who were strict determinists, believing that all beings were subject to an inexorable destiny, niyati, and that human effort was futile. The materialists, Lokayata, who denied the afterlife and karma, teaching that pleasure was the only goal of life. The skeptics, like Sanjaya Belatipada, who argued that metaphysical knowledge was impossible to attain and refused to take a position on any philosophical question. The Buddha was a product of this Sramana milieu. He was not preaching to an ignorant populace, but to a sophisticated audience that was already deeply engaged with questions of karma, rebirth, and liberation. His great innovation was not that he invented these concepts, but that he redefined them and synthesized them into a unique and compelling new path. A middle way that avoided the extremes he saw around him. The ritualism of the Brahmins, the extreme self-mortification of the Jains, the fatalism of the Ajivikas, and the nihilism of the materialists. Part 3. Reconstructing a life, the plausible historical core. By carefully evaluating the earliest textual layers against the backdrop of the known historical context, we can construct a plausible, if skeletal, biography of the historical Buddha. Birth and youth. A man named Siddhartha Gautama, in Pali. Siddhartha Gautama, was born sometime between the late 6th and early 5th centuries BCE. The traditional 563 BCE date is now contested by many scholars, with 480 BCE being a more likely starting point. He was born in Lumbini into the ruling warrior class family of the Shakya clan. His upbringing was one of aristocratic privilege, and he was likely trained in the arts of warfare and governance. He married and had a son. The renunciation. In his late 20s, the traditional age of 29 is plausible. Siddhartha experienced a profound existential crisis. The legendary story of the 4 sights, an old man, a sick man, a corpse, and a serene ascetic, likely represents a historical kernel, a growing disillusionment with the transient nature of worldly pleasure and a confrontation with the stark realities of human suffering and mortality. This motivated him to undertake the Great Renunciation, leaving his privileged life to become a homeless Sramana, a well-established, if radical, path for spiritual seekers of his time. The search for enlightenment. As a seeker, he did what other seekers did. He sought out the most respected teachers. The texts named two, Alara Kalama and Uddaka Ramapada. These figures are mentioned in a way that suggests they were real historical teachers of specific meditative techniques that led to high states of concentration. Finding these states profound but ultimately insufficient for total liberation, Siddhartha moved on. He then engaged in a period of severe asceticism, a common practice among Sramanas aimed at subjugating the body to free the spirit. The vivid and harrowing descriptions of his self-mortification in the Majjhima Nikaya have the ring of authentic memory. The awakening. After years of fruitless struggle, he realized that a tortured body could not support a clear mind. His critical breakthrough was the discovery of the middle way, a path that avoids the extremes of both sensual indulgence and self-torment. He began to eat again and sitting in meditation near a place that would come to be known as Bodh Gaya. He achieved a transformative experience he called awakening, or enlightenment, Bodhi. This was not a divine revelation, but a direct, intuitive insight into the nature of reality, which he later formulated as the Four Noble Truths and the principle of dependent origination. A 45-year ministry, following his awakening, he decided to teach. He walked to the deer park at Sarnath and delivered his first sermon to the 5 ascetics who had been his former companions. For the next 4.5 decades, he was an itinerant teacher, walking tirelessly across the Gangetic Plain, through the kingdoms of Magadha and Kosala. He proved to be an incredibly charismatic and effective teacher, drawing disciples from every social stratum, from kings and wealthy merchants to courtesans and poor farmers. Explicitly rejecting the caste system as a basis for spiritual worth, he founded a highly organized monastic community, the Sangha, and established a detailed code of conduct, the Vinaya, to ensure its longevity. He was a master debater, engaging with and often refuting the leading philosophers of his day, and his teachings were tailored with great psychological skill to the specific needs of his audience. Death and final instructions. He died at the age of 80 in the small, remote town of Kushinagar. The Mahaparinibbana Sutta, which gives a long, detailed account of his final months, is considered by scholars to contain a significant historical core. It depicts a very human end. The Buddha is old, frail, and falls ill after eating a meal offered by a blacksmith named Kunda. In his final hours, he comforts his grieving attendant, Ananda, urges his monks to rely on his teachings, the Dharma, and not on his person, and utters his final words: all conditioned things are subject to decay. Strive on with diligence. This is not the triumphant ascension of a god, but the serene passing of a great human teacher, confident that he has left behind a complete and effective path to liberation. Part 4. The Voice of the Buddha, the Core Teachings as Historical Evidence. Perhaps the most compelling argument for the existence of a single, historical founder is the doctrine itself. The body of teachings attributed to the Buddha in the earliest strata of the canon is not a haphazard collection of ideas, it is a remarkably coherent, original, and internally consistent philosophical and psychological system. This coherence strongly suggests it is the product of a single, brilliant, and innovative mind. The Buddha's teachings were revolutionary in their context. He offered a path to liberation that was pragmatic and empirical. He consistently refused to engage in metaphysical speculation about the creation of the universe, the nature of the soul after death, or the existence of a creator God. He called these questions a thicket of views that did not lead to liberation. His focus was intensely practical and psychological. What is suffering? What is its cause? How can it be ended? His method was experiential. Come and see for yourself, ehipassiko. Centered on a middle way. As discussed, he skillfully navigated a course between the competing ideologies of his time, rejecting both worldly indulgence and world-denying asceticism. Founded on the principle of no self, anatta, the Buddha's most unique and radical doctrine was his rejection of the prevailing Indian belief in an eternal, unchanging soul or self, Atman or Jiva. He taught that what we perceive as a self is merely an impermanent, interdependent process, a collection of 5 psycho-physical aggregates, khandhas. This insight was the key to uprooting the craving and clinging that lie at the heart of suffering. The originality of this doctrinal core, particularly the subtle synthesis of karma, rebirth, and the radical concept of no self, all framed within the pragmatic structure of the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, is very difficult to explain as the product of a committee or a gradual, anonymous evolution. It bears the unmistakable stamp of a single, visionary founder. Conclusion. Reconciling history and myth. The quest to uncover the real history of the Buddha does not, in the end, present us with a choice between a historical man and a divine myth. Rather, it reveals a 2-stage process. First, there was the man, Siddhartha Gautama, a sage of the Shakya clan, a product of the Sramana movement who, through his own profound efforts, achieved a transformative insight and spent a long life teaching a radical and liberating Dharma. His life and teachings form the historical bedrock of the tradition. Second, there was the response to this man, The generations of followers who experienced the power of his teachings were faced with the task of explaining the monumental significance of his life. How could an ordinary man have discovered something so profound? Their answer was to develop a sacred biography, a hagiography, where historical events were infused with mythic meaning. The birth was not just a birth, it was a cosmic event where a being of supreme purity entered the world. Hence the story of the 7 steps on lotus blossoms. The Enlightenment was not just a deep psychological insight, it was a universe-shaking victory over the fundamental forces of delusion and death. Hence the epic battle with the demon Mara. The man's life was so extraordinary that it could only be explained by positing that he had been preparing for it across countless lifetimes. Hence the Jataka tales. Uncovering the historical Buddha, therefore, does not diminish him. It allows us to appreciate the true scale of his achievement. It replaces the distant figure of a god with the far more intimate and inspiring figure of a human being who confronted the deepest problems of human existence and demonstrated, through his own life, that a path to peace, wisdom, and liberation was possible. The real history of the Buddha reveals that the most profound miracles were not walking on water or performing psychic feats, but the clarity of his insight, the depth of his compassion, and the enduring power of the path he opened for all humanity.